Of course, here is the story adapted with a French setting, characters, and cultural context, written in standard American English, while maintaining the length and core essence of the original. In the last 6 months, 7 nannies had fled the Dubois estate, a sprawling, minimalist fortress of glass and steel overlooking the city of Lyon. The statistic was whispered among the elite agencies that supplied staff to the city's wealthiest families. 7 highly qualified, rigorously vetted, professionals broken by 2 6-year-old boys. Their employer, Lucien Dubois, was a man whose name was spoken in hushed, respectful tones in boardrooms and in fearful whispers in the city's underbelly. He was the parrain of Le Cartel de Lyon, a man who could command armies of men with a single quiet word. Yet, he could not command his own twin sons, Remy and Pascal. They were his unsolvable problem, his gilded cage of failure, a daily reminder of the one part of his life that had spun violently out of his control. He threw resources at the cloak issue: therapists, behavioral specialists, and the endless parade of nannies, but the chaos only deepened, the silence in his vast home growing louder and more accusatory with each departure. The boys were more than just unruly. They were tactical, their tantrums precise, their destruction surgical. They were tiny sociopathic terrors wrapped in designer clothes, and they were winning. Lucien was a man accustomed to victory, to control, to order. The anarchy in his own home was a wound that refused to close, festering in the sterile quiet of his life. He was losing a war on the home front, a battle of attrition against 2 small boys who looked at him with their late mother's eyes and saw only a stranger. His empire was secure, but his family was a ruin. The lunchtime rush at the bustling bistrot was a symphony of controlled chaos, and Elodie was its conductor. Her world was the polar opposite of Lucien Dubois'. It wasn't glass and steel, it was linoleum and formica. The air didn't smell of expensive diffusers, but of sizzling saucisson, strong espresso, and the faint, sweet scent of desperation. Elodie moved through it with an economy of motion that was almost balletic, balancing plates on her arm, refilling carafes of water without breaking stride, and managing the cacophony with a tired, unimpressed grace. She was 28, burdened by her mother's medical bills, a debt that felt like a physical weight on her shoulders, and a quiet personal loss that had hollowed out a space in her heart years ago. Her beauty was the kind that hard work sharpens rather than softens. High cheekbones, intelligent, weary eyes, and a mouth that was quicker to a sarcastic smirk than a genuine smile. She didn't have time for nonsense. Her observational skills were honed by years of reading customers in a split second: who was a big tipper, who was going to complain, who was on a terrible first date. She saw the details others missed. It was a survival skill. So when the gleaming black sedan, silent as a shark, pulled up outside, she barely registered it. It was just another car. But when the man who stepped out entered the bistrot, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. Lucien Dubois was impeccably dressed in a tailored suit that probably cost more than her car, but it was his presence that commanded the space. It was a gravitational pull of power and sorrow. Flanking him were 2 identical boys, their small faces perfect, unsmiling masks. They were beautiful and terrible, and Elodie's internal nonsense detector went on high alert. Great, she thought, grabbing a cart. Looks like trouble, a side of fries and 0 tip. The moment they were seated in a booth, the performance began. It started with a low wail from one of the boys, Pascal, which was immediately matched in pitch and intensity by his brother, Remy. The sound cut through the bistrot's clatter like a surgeon's scalpel. Forks paused midair. Conversations faltered. Lucien's face, already a mask of stoic exhaustion, tightened. He leaned in, murmuring in French, his voice a low, urgent rumble. It had no effect. The wailing escalated into shrieks. Menus were torn into confetti. A sugar dispenser was upended, creating a miniature blizzard on the table. Pascal began kicking the underside of the table with a rhythmic, maddening thud, while Remy started methodically, flinging crayons at the adjacent booth. Lucian's bodyguards, standing stiffly by the door, looked as helpless as their boss. They could handle a street fight, but they were utterly outmatched by a pair of 6-year-olds. The other patrons shifted uncomfortably, their annoyance curdling into fear. This wasn't just a tantrum, it was a ziga. Elodie watched from behind the counter, her arms crossed. She'd seen it all before, just usually with less expensive shoes. She saw the father's desperation, the coiled tension in his shoulders. She saw the boy's eyes darting around, gauging the reaction, feeding on the chaos they created. But she also saw something else, something beneath the rage. A flicker of profound, bottomless panic. They weren't just angry, they were terrified. Her manager, a nervous man named Stefan, scurried over. "Do something," he hissed. "They're scaring everyone." Doing something was not in her job description. But as a spoon went flying past her head and clattered against the wall, a switch flipped. It wasn't annoyance. It was a strange, unwelcome surge of empathy. She untied her apron, letting it drop onto the counter. Enough was enough. She approached the table not as a waitress, but as a force of nature. She didn't look at Lucian. She ignored the bodyguards. Her entire focus was on the two small epicenters of the storm. She pulled a chair from a nearby table and sat down, placing herself at their eye level. The shrieking continued, but she didn't flinch. She simply waited, her presence a calm, unmovable object in their path of destruction. When Remy paused to take a breath before his next scream, Elodie spoke, her voice low and even, cutting through the din. "That's a good scream," she said, her tone utterly serious, as if complimenting a piece of art. "You've got the volume, but the pitch is a little shaky." Remy froze, his mouth open, utterly baffled. Pascal stopped kicking the table. They stared at her. No one had ever critiqued their tantrums before. Lucian looked at her as if she'd just sprouted a second head. "My brother," Elodie continued, gesturing vaguely behind her. "He was the master, could shatter glass at 20 paces. But you two have potential." She picked up a crayon from the floor, one that hadn't been snapped in half. She looked from Pascal to Remy. "The problem is, your strategy is all over the place. Tearing, throwing, screaming. It's unfocused. A real pro picks one thing and commits." She leaned forward conspiratorially. "You want to really get a reaction? You go silent." Total dead silence. Nothing unnerves adults more. The boys exchanged a look, a silent communication passing between them. The cogs were turning in their little heads. She had done the impossible. She had intrigued them. "Or," she said, her voice dropping even lower, "you could eat." She nodded, toward the kitchen. "I can get you crepes with chocolate and chantilly cream." Smiley faces. "But they only make them for guys who know how to use a fork. Not throw it." She held their gaze, an unblinking, no, nonsense stare that communicated she was not impressed, not intimidated, and not going anywhere. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the Dubois booth was silent. A profound, echoing silence descended. Lucien Dubois stared, his formidable composure completely fractured. He had witnessed a miracle. He had seen the Planck, world's most expensive child psychologists, fail, watched highly trained nannies flee in tears. He had tried everything: threats, bribes, reason, surrender. Nothing had worked. And now, this waitress in a cheap bistrot, with nothing but a chair and a deadpan delivery, had achieved total peace in under 2 minutes. Remy and Pascal were not just quiet. They were seated, their small hands in their laps, looking at Elodie with a mixture of awe and suspicion. "Crepes," Pascal whispered, the word a tentative flag of truce. Elodie nodded once. "Crepes," she confirmed. She stood up, pushed the chair back, and walked to the kitchen without a backward glance. 10 minutes later, she returned with 2 plates. Each held a large crepe adorned with a perfect chocolate and whipped cream smile. She set them down. The boys picked up their forks and, with a startlingly refined delicacy, began to eat. They didn't speak. They didn't make a mess. They just ate. The entire bistrot seemed to be watching, mesmerized. Lucian finally found his voice, a low, gravelly sound. "How did you do that?" Elodie shrugged, wiping down the sugar-coated table with a damp cloth. "They're not monsters. They're just kids testing the fences. They needed someone to stop, treating them like a problem to be solved and start treating them like people." She looked at him directly then, and for the first time, he felt truly seen. Not as a crime boss, not as a CEO, but as a failing father. Her eyes held no judgment, only a weary understanding. After the boys had cleaned their plates, Lucian paid the bill. A €100 note for a €20 meal. As Elodie was about to give him his change, he held up a hand. "Keep it," he said. Then he slid a black business card across the table. "That was not a request. It was an offer. I will triple whatever you make here. Name your price. I don't care. I need you to work for me." Elodie looked at the card, then at the two boys, who were now watching her with an unnerving intensity. This was insane. A crime boss wanted to hire her as a nanny. Her life was a mountain of debt and dead ends. This was a door opening to a world she couldn't even imagine, but a world that was dangerous and cold. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but then she looked at the boys again, at the bright, deep, ancient sadness in their eyes, and she saw the reflection of a loss she knew all too well. This wasn't just about money. This was about something else, entirely. "When do I start?" she asked. The Dubois estate was less a home and more a monument to absence. It sat perched on a hill, a fortress of solitude with panoramic windows that stared out at the Turnus city with cold indifference. As Elodie's taxi crunched up the long gravel driveway, she felt like she was entering a different dimension. The air was cleaner up here, the silence heavier. Her own apartment, with its noisy radiator and view of a brick wall, felt a universe away. The front door, a massive slab of dark wood, was opened by a woman in a severe, perfectly tailored gray dress. Her hair was pulled back in a chignon so tight it seemed to pull at the corners of her eyes, and her smile was a thin, bloodless line. "You must be Elodie," she said, her voice smooth and cold as polished marble. "I am Céline. I am Monsieur Dubois' executive assistant and manage the household staff." Céline's eyes swept over Elodie's simple jeans and jacket, a flicker of disdain in their depth. It was a look Elodie recognized instantly, the subtle dismissal of the wealthy for the working class. Céline was making it clear that Elodie was just another hired hand, and a highly suspect one at that. "Monsieur Dubois is unconventional in his hiring practices," Céline continued, leading her into a grand foyer that echoed with every footstep. "But I am sure you will find that a bistrot is very different from a home like this. We have standards." The thinly veiled insult hung in the air. Elodie met her gaze, refusing to be intimidated. "Don't worry," Elodie replied, her voice flat. "I'm a fast learner." Céline's smile tightened. She had expected deference, perhaps even fear. She had not expected quiet, unyielding confidence. This was the first shot in a war. Elodie hadn't even known she was fighting. The house was immaculate, sterile, and utterly joyless. There were no photographs on the walls, no toys scattered on the floor, no sign that children actually lived there. It was a museum of expensive furniture, a place where emotions came to die. Céline gave her a brisk tour, pointing out the state-of-the-art kitchen, the boys' designated playroom which looked more like a minimalist art installation, and Elodie's own quarters, a small but comfortable and suite that was larger than her entire apartment. "The boys are in their room," Céline said, a hint of warning in her tone. "They are adjusting. Do not be discouraged if they are not immediately receptive." The last one lasted less than 48 hours. There was a distinct note of satisfaction in her voice, as if she were proud of the boys' destructive capabilities. Elodie understood immediately. Céline wasn't an ally. She was the gatekeeper, and she enjoyed watching people fail. Elodie found the boys' room at the end of a long white hallway. The door was slightly ajar. She pushed it open gently and stepped inside. The room was a diptych of chaos and order. On one side, books were neatly stacked and toys were spreeple, arranged with geometric precision. On the other, it looked like a hurricane had hit, and in the center of the room, Remy and Pascal stood waiting for her. They were dressed in identical gray sweaters, their dark hair perfectly combed. They looked like little porcelain dolls, but their eyes held the glint of seasoned generals surveying a battlefield. This was their territory, and she was the intruder. They had prepared a welcome. A tripwire made of dental floss was strung across the entrance. Elodie saw it instantly. The faint shimmer just above the plush, white carpet. She didn't break her stride. With a single deliberate motion, she lifted her foot high and stepped over it, not even glancing down. The boy's eyes widened slightly. Phase 1 of their attack had failed. She walked to the center of the room, setting down her single duffel bag. Then, she looked at the mess. A lamp was overturned, its shade askew. Cushions were disemboweled, their white stuffing spilling out like artificial snow. A complex Lego structure had been smashed into 1,000 pieces. Display of destructive power, Elodie surveyed the damage with the detached air of an insurance adjuster. She didn't gasp. She didn't scold. She simply turned to the two silent boys. "All right," she said, her voice calm. "Here's the first rule. There's only one, so it should be easy to remember." They stared at her, their expressions unreadable. "We don't break things in this house," she stated, not as a plea, but as a statement of fact. She then knelt, picking up a single red Lego brick from the carnage. "We fix them." She looked directly at Remy, then at Pascal. "So, we're going to start by cleaning this up, all of it, together." She expected resistance, another tantrum, perhaps a complete refusal. Instead, they just watched her, their silence a weapon she had yet to understand. She began to pick up the larger pieces of the lamp, fitting the shade back onto its base. After a long moment, Pascal took a hesitant step forward and picked up a handful of white stuffing. Remy remained motionless, his arms crossed, watching her with an unnerving, analytical gaze. He was the strategist, the one who would be harder to crack. This wasn't a victory, not even close. It was merely the opening move in a very long, very complicated game. The days that followed were a cold war fought in a silent house. The boys' plaint tactics shifted from overt destruction to a sophisticated campaign of psychological warfare. They wouldn't speak to her, communicating only with each other in rapid-fire French she could barely follow. They would obey her direct instructions to the absolute letter, but with a malicious compliance that was infuriating. If she told them to put their toys away, they would stack them in a precarious, teetering tower that was guaranteed to collapse. If she told them to eat their vegetables, they would chew each pea with excruciating slowness, turning a 10-minute meal into an hour-long ordeal. They were a united front, a two-person army of passive resistance. Céline watched from the sidelines, her presence a constant, chilling pressure. She would appear silently in doorways, a faint, knowing smirk on her lips as Elodie struggled. She made sure to report every minor incident to Lucien, framing Elodie's patient approach as incompetence. "The boys are still refusing to engage, Monsieur Dubois," she would say, her voice dripping with false concern. Perhaps someone with more formal qualifications would be better suited. Elodie knew she was being undermined, isolated. She was fighting on two fronts, against the calculated rebellion of the children and the subtle sabotage of the Pramant woman who wanted her gone. Kenji remained a ghost in his own home. He left before the boys woke up and returned long after they were asleep. His interactions with his children were limited to brief, awkward encounters in the prosent hallway. Moments filled with a chasm of unspoken grief and misunderstanding. He saw the surface that the house was no longer being destroyed and mistook the crowed absence of chaos for progress. He didn't see the silent, bitter war being waged in its pristine rooms. Elodie knew she couldn't win by imposing more rules or demanding respect. That was the old way, the way the other 7 nannies had tried. She had to find a crack in their armor. She started watching them, truly watching, not as a warden, but as a detective. She noticed the small things, how they always left a space or empty between them on the sofa, a space for a third person. How Remy, the stoic one, would sometimes trace a pattern on the dusty surface of a side table, a pattern that looked like a letter. And most importantly, she noticed the photograph. It was the only personal item in the entire public space of the house, a small, silver-framed picture on the mantelpiece in the cavernous living room. It was of a beautiful woman with a radiant smile. Her arms wrapped around two much younger, happier versions of Remy and Pascal. The boys never touched it, but their eyes were always drawn to it. It was their compass, their northern star in this cold, empty galaxy of a home. Céline, she noted, always made a point of turning it slightly away, as if its very presence were an offense. That photograph, Elodie realized, was the key. It was the source of their pain, and the only possible path to their hearts. The breakthrough came late one night during a thunderstorm that rattled the great glass windows of the estate. Elodie was in her room reading when she heard a small, muffled cry. It wasn't a tantrum shriek. It was the raw, unguarded sound of fear. She followed the noise to the boys' room and found Pascal sitting bolt upright in his bed, his small body trembling. Remy was awake in the other bed, pretending to be asleep but failing, his knuckles white where he clutched his blanket. A loud clap of thunder shook the house, and Pascal flinched violently. Elodie didn't turn on the main light. She simply walked over and sat on the edge of his bed. She didn't offer empty platitudes like, "It's just a storm," or "There's nothing to be afraid of." She knew fear wasn't rational. Instead, she just sat there, a solid, calming presence in the dark. "My little brother was afraid of thunder too," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. "He used to say it was the sound of giants bowling in the clouds." Pascal looked at her, his eyes wide with tears in the dim light. He didn't say anything, but he stopped trembling. "So I told him a story," Elodie continued, "about two brothers, not giants. Just two regular brothers, and they weren't afraid of anything. Not storms, not shadows, not even the silence." She began to weave a simple tale, not a fairy tale with dragons and castles, but a story about two brave explorers named Remy and Pascal, who mapped the dark corners of their own house, who built forts out of blankets that could withstand any storm, and who always had each other's backs. She spoke for a long time, her voice a low, steady anchor in the raging storm outside. When she finished, Pascal had curled up under his covers, his breathing evening out into the rhythm of sleep. As she stood to leave, a small voice came from the other bed. "Their mother," Remy said, his voice thick with sleep but sharp with intent. "What happened to the mother in the story?" Elodie paused at the door, her back to him. This was it, the crack in the wall. "She was a star," Elodie said softly, "the brightest one in the sky. So even when they couldn't see her, she was always there, watching over them." She left the room, closing the door quietly behind her. She leaned against the bronze wall in the silent hallway, her heart aching. The war wasn't over, but she had just won a crucial battle. She had given their grief a name and a place, not as an ending, but as a part of their story. With that small bridge of trust established, Elodie began her investigation in earnest. She pieced together the fragments she had observed: the boys' obsessive attachment to the photograph, their violent reactions to any changes in the Prost house, their strategic grief. She knew Céline was at the center of it, but she needed proof. The house staff, terrified of Céline, were of little help, offering only nervous glances and whispered warnings. Elodie realized she had to find the truth herself. She started with the date. She discreetly checked Lucien's private calendar in his study one afternoon while he was out, and Céline was occupied with a phone call. She found it, circled in red pen 2 weeks from now. A simple, stark annotation. Isabelle. A quick search on the household computer confirmed her suspicion. Isabelle Dubois, beloved wife of Lucien Dubois, had died in a tragic car accident 1 year ago on that exact date. The boys hadn't just lost their mother. They were approaching the first anniversary of that loss, a day of immense, unspoken trauma. Everything clicked into place. Their escalating behavior wasn't random. It was a desperate, primal scream against the encroaching date, a day the entire house seemed determined to ignore. Céline wasn't just managing the household, she was systematically erasing Isabelle's memory. Elodie started noticing the small, cruel details. A vase of Isabelle's favorite flowers replaced with Céline's. A book of Isabelle's poetry vanishing from the shelf. Céline's perfume subtly beginning to linger in the hallways. She was a ghost, trying to exorcise another. Her goal was clear: to remove every trace of the former mistress of the house, to create a vacuum that only she could fill. She was convincing Lucien that moving on meant forgetting, and that the boy's grief was a sickness to be cured with discipline and distraction, rather than a wound that needed to be cleaned and healed. Céline was weaponizing their trauma, using their lashing out as proof that they needed a firm maternal hand. Her hand. The boys weren't being monsters. They were defending their mother's memory the only way they knew how. They were fighting to keep her alive in a house that was trying to suffocate her ghost. Elodie felt a cold, hard anger settle in her chest. This wasn't about a job anymore. This was about protecting two children from a predator hiding in plain sight. She knew a direct confrontation with Céline would be a disaster. Céline was a master manipulator and had Lucien's complete trust. Elodie would be fired, and the boys would be left alone with their tormentor. No, she couldn't fight Céline on her terms. She had to change the battlefield. She had to give the present boys a voice, a way to express their grief that wasn't destructive. She had to set a trap, and she needed Céline to walk right into it. With Lucien there to witness it all, Elodie knew she had to arm the boys, not with anger, but with memory. She started talking to them about their mother, not in hushed, sad tones, but in a celebratory way. "Your mother had a beautiful smile," she'd say, glancing at the photograph on the mantel. "I bet she told the best stories." At first, they remained silent, wary. But Elodie was persistent. She found a small, locked chest in the back of a storage closet, a chest Céline had clearly overlooked. Inside were Isabelle's things, a silk scarf that still held her faint floral scent, a collection of worn children's books she used to read to them, a small music box that played a soft lullaby. It was a treasure trove of memories. She brought the box to their room. "I think these belong to you," she said, simply. For the first time, she saw them break. Remy picked up the scarf and held it to his face, his small shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Pascal opened the music box, and the gentle, tinkling melody filled the room, a sound of love and loss that was almost unbearable. They weren't fighting her anymore. They were trusting her. Together, in secret, they began to build a memorial. It was their project, their act of defiance. They used an empty corner of their playroom, a space Céline never checked. They gathered the items from the chest. They drew pictures of their mother, bright, colorful, smiling portraits. They wrote her notes on construction paper, their childish scrawls full of love. Elodie helped them, not by directing, but by facilitating. She provided the supplies, the encouragement, and the security. She was helping them channel their chaotic, destructive energy into something focused, beautiful, and profoundly healing. The plan was simple, and its success depended on timing. Céline was planning a very lavish dinner party for some of Lucien's most important business associates. It was her grand performance, a chance to showcase herself as the perfect hostess, the future Madame Dubois. The house was a flurry of activity, with caterers and florists transforming the sterile space into a theatrical display of wealth. Céline was in her element, sharp and imperious, her attention focused entirely on the evening's success. Was when Céline's mask would be at its most polished, and therefore most brittle. On the afternoon of the party, as the final preparations were being made, Elodie spoke to the boys. "Tonight," she said, kneeling before them, "you can show your father what you've made. You can show him how much you love your mother." Remy looked at her, his eyes clear and steady. The fear was gone, replaced by a quiet resolve. "He will listen?" he asked. "Yes," Elodie promised, a vow she intended to keep. "Tonight, everyone will listen." The evening air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the low hum of powerful conversations. The dinner party was in full swing. Céline was a vision of poised perfection, gliding through the living room, her laughter light, musical, her hand resting possessively on Lucien's arm. She was playing the role of her life, and she was flawless. Lucien looked on, a faint, distant smile on his face. He saw the beautiful woman, the successful party, the illusion of a life rebuilt. He was a king in his castle, completely blind to the rot in its foundations. Elodie stood in the shadows of the hallway, watching. The boys were upstairs, waiting for her signal. The timing had to be perfect. She waited until Céline had gathered everyone for a toast, her voice rising above the chatter, a speech about new beginnings and bright futures. It was a sickeningly sweet performance. This was the moment. Elodie gave a slight nod to the top of the grand staircase. Two small figures appeared. Remy and Pascal, dressed in matching suits, began to descend. They weren't crying or screaming. They were silent, dignified, and they each carried something. Remy held a framed drawing of their mother, and Pascal held the small, tinkling music box. They walked directly to their father, ignoring the Brett's stunned silence that fell over the room. Remy held the picture up to Lucien. "For you, Papa," he said, his voice clear and strong. "So you don't forget, Maman." Lucien stared at the drawing, his face paling. He looked utterly lost, as if he'd been woken from a long dream. The music box played its gentle, heartbreaking lullaby, cutting through the tense silence. It was then that Céline's mask didn't just slip, it shattered. All her carefully constructed composure vanished, replaced by a raw, venomous fury. She turned on the boys, her voice a venomous hiss that was shockingly loud in the quiet room. "What is this? I told you to get rid of all of that woman's things. You are ruining everything." Her words hung in the air, ugly and undeniable. She hadn't whispered it. She had shouted it, her rage eclipsing all her ambition and calculation. Every guest, every associate, and most importantly, Lucien Dubois heard her. He turned to look at Céline, and for the first time since Elodie had met him, his eyes were not weary or distant. They were blazing with a cold, terrifying clarity. He finally saw her. Not the perfect hostess, not the supportive partner, but the cruel, ambitious user who had been systematically torturing his children and erasing his wife. The silence that followed was absolute. Céline realized what she had done. The color drained from her face. She had set her own trap and walked right into it. In her desperate attempt to secure her future, she had revealed her monstrous present and, in doing so, had utterly destroyed it. The aftermath was swift and silent. Céline was dismissed, not with a shout but with a single quiet word from Lucien. She vanished from the house as quickly and completely as she had tried to make Isabelle's memory disappear. The guests melted away, leaving a house filled with half-empty glasses and the deafening sound of truth. For a long time, the three remaining Dubois stood in the grand living room, a broken triangle of grief. Then Lucien did something Elodie had never seen him do. He sank to his knees, pulling his sons into his arms. He held them not as a symbol of his failure, but as his children, and he wept, great, shuddering sobs that came from a place of profound, unexpressed sorrow. He grieved with them, and for himself. The boys clung to him, their own tears soaking his expensive suit, the music box still playing its soft, sad song. Elodie watched from a distance, her own eyes burning. She felt like an intruder on this sacred, painful moment. She turned to leave, to give them their privacy. Her job, now, truly done. Don't go. Lucian's voice, thick with emotion, stopped her. He looked up at her, his face wrecked with tears but his eyes clear. Please, stay. It wasn't an order from an employer to an employee. It was a plea from one human employer, being to another. The days that followed were quiet. But it was a different kind of quiet. It was the peaceful silence of healing, not the sterile silence of absence. Lucian started coming home earlier. He had dinner with his sons every night. They talked about their mother, sharing stories, keeping her memory alive not as a ghost of sadness but as a beacon of love. The house began to change. The boys' colorful drawings were framed and hung on the pristine white walls. Toys appeared in the living room. The air began to smell like a home, filled with the scent of baking madeleines and the sound of laughter. Elodie stayed. Her role shifted from warden to healer, from nanny to something that didn't have a name. She was the anchor, the bridge between a father and his sons. She taught them how to fix what was broken. Not just lamps and Legos, but hearts too. One evening, months later, the four of them were in the backyard, a space that had once been a perfectly manicured but unused lawn. It now was home to a swing, set, and a chaotic vegetable garden. Remy and Pascal were trying to teach their father how to properly kick a soccer ball, a task at which the powerful Perrine was proving comically inept. Elodie sat on the porch steps watching them, a genuine, unforced smile on her face. The weight of her debts seemed lighter. The Grezin overforced, hollow space in her heart a little less empty. Lucian caught her eye and smiled back, a real smile that reached his eyes. In that moment, surrounded by the warm glow of the setting sun, she realized she had found something she hadn't even been looking for. It wasn't a family by any conventional definition, but it was a family nonetheless. A fixer, a crime boss, and two little boys. A strange and broken quartet who, together, were slowly, surely making themselves whole again.